Welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm your host, Keith Nestor. On this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith with everyday life. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Down to Earth Ministry, a ministry of stewardship, a mission of faith, and by the generous support of our patrons. For more information, please visit downtoearthministry.org. That's down, the number 2, earthministry.org. Let's get to it. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Catholic Feedback from the back of our RV. Stella and I are traveling right now, and we are parked at an RV park in Santa Fe, New Mexico, on our first Rosary Road Crew trip. And while we're on the trip, we're still making podcasts, making content. And actually, our first stop that we had was in Kansas City with my good friend Joe Heschmeyer, who was recently on the podcast to talk about why we need the Pope. And Joe and I had such a great conversation. I thought, hey, we need to do this again. And Joe has graciously agreed to be with us here once again, because I have just a few follow-up questions that I think are really important to this understanding of the papacy. So everyone, welcome Joe. Joe, so glad to have you back, man.
It is my pleasure. It was so good to see you in person. So good to be on the show last time. I'm looking forward to it this time.
Isn't it great to finally be able to meet people in person from
Exactly.
YouTube world or whatever? And I don't know, we need that, don't we?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you were a lot of fun. I really enjoyed your wife too. You're just like real people. It was great.
Oh man, we're 100% real people, that's for sure. Sometimes a little too real, but yeah, no, likewise, and just a great time to be with you, and I'm really excited to see the reaction to your episode of Catholic Feedback, the first one, and I know that there'll be a lot of great comments, a lot of great follow-up. I'm probably like 90% done with your book, Pope Peter, and there's a lot of things in that book that I've really resonated with. And I know last week we talked about why we need the Pope, why that's important to Christianity, and why it makes sense. And it's interesting to talk to people who don't have that perspective and then do, like converts like me. And I was with a convert last night, actually, having dinner, and we were talking about how before we had the papacy, that there was just we felt like we were sort of out there on our own trying to figure everything out. And of course, in that world, there are so many different variations of opinions and beliefs. But when we have the papacy, there's a uniting figure there and a place where we can go to find out what we truly believe as Christians.
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge, and it's something that it really is properly understood. Such a tremendous gift for the church.
Yeah, so let's talk today a little bit more about some of the historical developments, because, your book is called Pope Peter, and the case could be made that, well, okay, I can see how in the Bible that, Jesus calls Peter to this special ministry and has a special thing for him. But this whole idea of, apostolic succession and how is it that we can look back through time and still find this unbroken chain of popes? I mean, give me a break. Like some people say that there's no way that can actually be reality. So how do we know what happens after Peter?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to say maybe a few things from a kind of a preamble, which is first, if you are a Protestant launching the show who's used to saying, well, all of my doctrines have to come from the Bible alone, just be aware that the particular question you're asking now kind of by definition can't be answered by the Bible alone. If you're looking for the list of people after the apostles who were, popes, you're not going to find that in the Bible. There isn't some, here's all the popes for the rest of history kind of appendix at the end of the Bible, right? So a lot of what I think we're going to be talking about today is going to be just historical evidence outside the Bible. And that's not because we don't love the Bible. It's not because we don't trust the Bible. It's because in the same way that, if you said, well, who was the first president of the Southern Baptist Convention? I'm not going to pull up Galatians, right? I'm going to do a little bit of research in history. So I wanted to say that just at the outset, because I always feel weird when we talk history the whole time and don't throw in the Bible a lot. So just in case it goes there. But second, I think we need to take history very seriously as Christians. And one of the reasons I think we need to take it seriously is because Christianity is different from other religions, especially other mythological religion, Greco-Roman myths and even stuff in the East, like Buddhism and Hinduism. The stories they tell, there's not a clear sense that they think that they actually occurred in history. They're just sort of like stories that reveal a true thing about reality, that kind of thing. Almost like, I don't want to put it in this category, but almost like what we do with like a fable. But Christianity is like, no, no, no. The stories we're telling about Jesus and the resurrection, they actually happened. Like, they're actually true. His parables, we're not arguing for their historicity. We're not saying, well, was there really a shepherd who had 99 sheep and one went missing? You know, like, no. But when we say that Jesus rose from the dead, it's in a different category of thing than like the lost sheep. And so how do we know the resurrection's true? I want to start with that because I think that'll give us a little bit of like a toolkit. And we know it's true for a few reasons. First, because there were eyewitnesses. And second, because the documents describing the events of the resurrection are really early on. We're talking maybe 60, 70, 80, 90, like that range. And so the important thing there is that you have the eyewitnesses, not just of the people writing, but you also have all the people who could fact check it. You also have all the people who are reading it who would know whether the events are true or not. So, you know, for instance, when St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that 500 people witnessed one of the resurrection appearances and that most of them are still living. Okay, well, why is he mentioning that most of them are still living? He's inviting his readers to check this fact. He's inviting them to call his bluff, as it were. That's what we're looking for in history. And so when you have something within a few decades, then you've got a really high degree of likelihood that the thing being described is true. Why do I mention that? Because how do we know the papacy is true? We have really good evidence from the first 200 years. We have really good evidence from the lifetimes of either the apostles or the generation after them. And when we look at that evidence, it's right there in black and white. So I kind of wanted to start maybe around 180 and move our way backwards, if that works with you. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds great to me.
Okay, great. So the clearest bit of evidence that we get in terms of how do we know who was Pope is from St. Irenaeus, who is Bishop of Lyon in southern France. And he's written a book called Against Heresies, like I said, about 180. And in book 3, chapter 3 of that, he talks about these, as the book suggests from the title, he's arguing against different heretics. And one of the things he says is that they ignore both scripture and tradition. That's book 3, chapter 2. And so already we see this idea that the early church puts a strong emphasis on both scripture and tradition, and that the heretics are like ignoring both of these things when Christians appeal, or when the Orthodox Christians appeal to them. And so he says, okay, well, you can know that their teaching isn't true because it doesn't originate with the apostles. We can know their teaching isn't true because we can trace it to its origins. That this is like someone with their own interpretation of scripture. This is someone with their own interpretation of what tradition should have been. And when we compare it to the living church, when we compare it to the actual apostolically founded churches, they don't match up. And so he looks through. I mean, so all of book 3, chapter 3 kind of goes through this. And he says, look, it's within the power of all in every church who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. And he says, we're in a position to reckon up those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the church and to show the succession of these men to our own times. Okay, so what's he saying there? This is very much like the kind of thing that St. Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 15. He's saying, whoever you are reading this, wherever you are in the world, now the world at that time, think like Roman Empire, you can go and find a local church that was founded by the apostles, and they keep records going all the way back to the time of the apostles. Like they can trace every bishop they ever had back to the apostles. That's the claim he's making. And he kind of, he uses that to show like, well, look, if the apostles taught Gnosticism or if they taught, fill in the blank heresy, those churches would have known it because they do such a good job of like holding to what the apostles taught, and they keep all their records, they keep all of this tradition, this data. You're not going to just have like this whole teaching system just disappear and another one step in. That's his point. Like that's kind of the argument in a nutshell. But then in the next paragraph, he says, well, it'd be very tedious to do that with all of the churches. Like if he were to make his book just be a list after list after list of every list of bishops in all of the world, that would be a terrible book, and he knows it. Thanks be to God. So instead he says, well, okay, it'll be enough to show the tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by putting out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of the bishops. But then he explains, well, why did he choose Rome? After all, he's the bishop in Lyon. Why not choose, somewhere in France? And he says, well, it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. Oh. So what have we got right there? We've got a few things. Number one, this idea of apostolic succession is not just some wacky idea Irenaeus has. He's saying, no, this is a universal practice of the church. Like, this is a universal belief of the church. And if you don't believe me, you can go and ask. Like, you can find the information yourself, and you'll see. But then second, he says, okay, that's like a safeguard against heresy. Because if you're interpreting the Bible in a way nobody else has before, one of the ways we can tell that is, well, look, we've got this tradition. We know who founded this church. We know where it's coming from. We know where its authority is. Now, where's your authority coming from? That kind of question, which I wish we would do better at asking today, quite frankly. But then he shows, like, look, the Roman bishop, the Bishop of Rome, it's important that everyone agree with him on account of this preeminent authority. And so, as you might guess from that setup, he then proceeds to go from Peter to Linus to Cletus, Clement, all the way down, and just shows, every pope up to the time of his own day in 180. Eleutherius was pope at the time. I think he was the 13th pope. So he shows us the first 13 popes. So right there, like, that's the kind of long-winded answer to the question of how do we know who the popes were? Well, because there's a lot of historical records, and we have really explicit testimony like that.
I think that's so cool, because I remember when I was in Rome as a Protestant years ago, and we went to St. John Lateran in Rome, and in this church they have all these pictures, these drawings or whatever, and the top going all the way around of all the popes. And back then it was Pope St. John Paul II, who's the pope when I was there, all the way back to Peter. And I remember looking at that going, man, is that true? Is this really a thing? Because of course, we didn't have anything like that in the tradition I came from. And the idea that there's this unbroken line of succession that goes all the way back there, it's a powerful thing. But I also like the fact that when you talk about the evidence that we use for this is the same type of evidence that all Christians really use for the resurrection. But what's interesting to me sometimes is that I feel like people apply the standard differently when it comes to Catholicism. They'll say about the resurrection, they'll say, well, we know the resurrection is true because the accounts were within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses who could verify, or they would call it out and say, nope, that's not true. Because they wanted to. The Romans hated the Christians, the Jews hated the Christians. If anybody could have produced a body or knocked down this idea of the resurrection, that would have ended Christianity right there on the spot. But they didn't do it. Why? Because it's true. So if we apply that same logic to the idea of the papacy, I think we can get there, because it's still within. I mean, was there anybody because I'm not an expert on who Irenaeus was arguing with, but was there anybody who, when he made that claim that of, was like, are you crazy? What are you talking about? That's not true. You guys just made that up. What do you mean? What do you mean list of bishops back to Peter and Rome? And why are you talking about Rome as preeminence? That's ridiculous. No,
actually. So a few things. One, we don't see that. And it'd be easy for the person who's maybe not sympathetic to that to say, well, maybe they destroyed that evidence. Maybe they got rid of it. But it's like, well, we don't see it. And the Christians actually did a pretty good job of keeping an account of what their opponents' arguments were, just so they could answer them. So, one of the major ways we even know what Gnosticism taught is from the writings against Gnosticism from the Christians, because those were the writings that were really savored and kept. People weren't in a big rush to keep the Gnostic writings, but they were in a big rush to keep the responses to Gnosticism. So you would think if someone had called this out as a ridiculous argument, we'd find some historical evidence of it. Or you would just see it laughed out of the room. You would just see Against Heresies wouldn't have been a classic. It would have been a dud. Like, people wouldn't have kept it. They wouldn't have copied it. They wouldn't like keep repeating this same failed argument. That's, yeah, I think the first kind of major argument. But we also see other people like Tertullian, 20 years later, makes a very similar argument, saying like, we can tell which churches are apostolic because all of them keep records, and he just treats this as kind of like a given. So he's making those same kind of appeals, which again wouldn't be happening if it was just bogus, right? Like it wouldn't be happening if it was just nonsense. But then I like the thing you said about, you know, the lifetimes, right? So Irenaeus was born around 130 in Asia Minor, in Smyrna. That matters because Polycarp was bishop of Smyrna. And so Polycarp was an actual student of the Apostle John. Polycarp was born in 70 AD and died in 155. He and Saint Ignatius of Antioch are the two disciples of John that we know today. And Irenaeus refers to Polycarp as someone who had the teaching of the apostles still ringing in his ears, which is a beautiful way of saying, you know, so he studies under John. Like I said, he's born in 70. John dies around 100. So for like the first 30 years of his life, he's like personally acquainted with an apostle who he ends up studying under, and who he's living in the same kind of geographic proximity of. That's an important, like, this is a guy who is soaked in the faith in a really deep way. Like, it's hard to believe that he would be just totally radically off base about what the apostles taught. Like, that he just didn't get it after 30 years of being with him. Or, you know, that, in other words, like, it's not impossible, right? Like, we can say, oh, well, you know, there are times the apostles don't understand what Jesus was saying or whatever. But that's more a question of interpretation. If they went out and said, oh, yeah, Jesus taught reincarnation, we'd be like, well, what do we make of that? You know what I mean? Like, it'd be crazy that they would get the actual teaching itself that radically wrong, spending 3 years with him. So here's someone who spends the first 30 years of his life in Smyrna, you know, under the tutelage of John the Apostle. That's Polycarp, right? So 70 to 100. Polycarp ends up becoming the bishop of Smyrna, right? Yeah, he's bishop of Smyrna. And so he dies in 155, and he's an old man. He's 87. We actually know he's an old man because he actually is martyred, and they ask him to deny the faith, and he talks about how, you know, having been able to give so many decades of his life to the faith, it'd be ridiculous at the end to deny it. And so he actually rejoices in the fact that he lived this long life as a disciple of Christ. It's a really beautiful kind of account, and it speaks to him, being an old man. Well, here's why that matters, because Irenaeus, who we just heard from, he is born in 130. So he has about the same relationship to Polycarp that Polycarp has to the Apostle John.
Right.
That he's born in Smyrna, and so for the first 25 years of his life, he's living in the diocese that Polycarp ends up being the bishop of. So he knows this kind of teaching, and it's a small enough world at the time. It isn't like, you know, this, it's not like the Diocese of Los Angeles where you can like have millions of people and you never really meet your bishop or whatever because it's just so big. We're talking about a small town in Asia Minor with like a handful of Christians. So the idea that like he managed to escape from this without ever hearing or understanding the apostolic truth is crazy. So my point in saying all of this is like Polycarp knows what he's talking about. Irenaeus knows what he's talking about. So we can trace just in two men's lifetimes. Like, if corruption set in, if the papacy is some sort of like heretical abomination that crept in, which of these two guys didn't notice that? Like, which of these two guys dropped the ball because they were alive and should have noticed? When did the papacy actually arise? Like, did it arise during the lifetime of Irenaeus or during the lifetime of Polycarp? Because you don't have another option. Like, if you're going to say that the papacy didn't start with the apostles, didn't start with Christ, you got to choose one of these guys, not just lifetimes, one of their adulthoods. Like, you got to choose one of the times when these guys is like alive and well and guarding Christian orthodoxy. You got to say, well, one of these two guys dropped the ball, because there's not another way around it, that they could end up believing that that it's important that everyone agree with the Pope. And here's the list of popes. Like, it's just right there. It's right there in the evidence.
That's so huge. So let's talk about this for a second, because here's the narrative that is often thrown at us, is that you have the early church of the apostles, which is, of course, supposedly looks a lot like, Protestantism, because it's all based on the Bible, even though the canon wasn't done yet. And then what happens is Constantine comes along and makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, which he didn't do, but that's the narrative, is that he did that. And then, of course, what he said then was, now we have to take all this pagan stuff, and we need like a religious ruler. So let's just create the papacy. So that's like the idea would be like 4th century, the papacy's created. So my question in the narrative against it. So is there a point in time when like anti-Catholics say, okay, here's the first guy that we can point to and say he was actually the Pope? 'Cause I think what they would do is they'd look back at the different bishops or whatever and say, well, they weren't really a papacy. They were just a random bishop. But when is the first time that an anti-Catholic would agree, now we have what's referred to as a pope that is the universal teacher of the whole Christian faith?
It's wild. I love that question because there's just not an answer to that question.
Really?
What I mean by that, it's terrible. Because even when you get like Gregory and Leo, who make these really bold kind of papal claims, they're like, well, we see the beginnings of the papacy, but they're not fully like papal yet. And it's like, what do you mean by pope? And if you really follow the argument out, like one of the arguments you'll often hear is like, well, why doesn't Peter just decide everything at the Council of Jerusalem? If he's really the Pope, he has to decide like everything. He can't have like an ecumenical council. It's like, okay, so by that definition, like John the 23rd and Paul the 6th aren't Pope because they have Second Vatican Council. Like, you've got 23 ecumenical councils in the church. If your standard for the papacy is like you can't have a council because the Pope is too like egocentric to allow that to happen, okay, there's 23 councils you got to deal with besides the Council of Jerusalem. And you got local councils where like they're not even ecumenical councils, but they're just local councils of the Bishop of Rome called with like local bishops in the area to discuss theological issues. So what you kind of have is this standard of the papacy that's so much a straw man that like it's not clear that any pope in history actually meets the definition of pope that the people arguing against the papacy are kind of laying out. That'd be the first thing I'd say. Second thing is I try to just pin people down as to like who was the first single bishop of Rome. Because a lot of the people who deny the papacy say, well, the early church was governed by a panel of bishops, even though we can name every single individual bishop. They can't name anyone on this panel. Like, it's a total legend. It's a total fabrication. And no one in the early church claims. Like, no one before Constantine is saying any of the apostolic churches were governed by a panel of bishops. Nobody, or like a panel of presbyters, right? So
Right.
It's the idea that like instead of having one guy in charge, you got like a group of people in charge, a committee or something, presbytery. There's literally no one making that argument in the early church. It's only centuries later that you have people looking back, and at that point, they're able to get the history wrong. The guys in the first 200 years are too close to get the history wrong for the reasons we just saw. And so they're not making the Protestant claims. Like, the first time you get anyone making anything like the Protestant claim in terms of the structure of the church is St. Jerome. And he's writing in like the late 4th, early 5th century. Like, he's writing much later, and it's not entirely, like, his argument's kind of a weird one. He still believes in the papacy, but he thinks it evolved from like a group of presbyters, and like one of them took on the title. There's a lot sacramentally and theologically going on in his writings. He's writing against a deacon to try to show that priests are better than deacons. That's the first time you see something. It's way later. The early evidence is all unanimous in favor of there not being that. Like, when we name anyone who's in like leadership structure in the church, we can point all over the place to single bishops of local churches. We can point nowhere to a group of like co-ruling presbyter bishops. And so that kind of thing is just like baseline evidence, right? Like, if you're going to make this claim about history and your opponents can give you that much information, you can't give any like names and dates or locations or anything. That just doesn't seem like a serious theory. What it is, if we're being totally frank, like, there is this Darwinian idea that everything evolves from simple things to complex things. And this idea was really latched onto by a certain brand of Protestantism, especially like German Protestantism in the 19th century. And so it applies it to everything. It's the same thing you see in liberal theology saying, well, Ephesians, the argument goes, couldn't have been written by St. Paul because it's so sophisticated in its arguments about the church. So it must have been written by somebody else. So it's not actually looking at the evidence. It's starting with this evolutionary theory of everything, that everything goes from simple to complex. The papacy looks like really sophisticated, so it must be later in time. But that's a starting philosophy. You're not looking at the evidence and forming the conclusion. You're starting with a kind of a dogmatic belief and a Darwinian vision of everything, and applying that to a history that says something very different. That's bad history. That's bad scholarship, right? This is also we see this argument all over the place. Like the number one argument you hear for why Mark's gospel must have been written first is it's the shortest. It's that same argument, and it's just that's a bad argument no matter where you're applying it. The definitive Churchill biography is one of the first ones written about him. It's long. The later biographies are shorter. You can't just say everything goes from short to long, simple to complex. It's a bad kind of type of argumentation. I think a lot of conservative Protestants who quote these guys don't realize that if you actually took their vision of the world seriously, you'd have to reject big parts of the New Testament as not really apostolic. You'd have to reject big parts of the Christian faith as these later accretions, because all of that is consistent with this argument. But what you have is, I think you've got a lot of Protestants who say, well, surely this didn't exist then, and no real clear sense of the history to know when to plug in names or dates. I know, again, a kind of a long answer to your question, but it's an issue I've really tried to press people on and haven't gotten a lot of traction with.
Well, I think it's super important because, if you're, and I've heard you talk about this before, and I certainly have too, the whole idea of Protestant until proven Catholic or whatever. But when you recognize that it should be flipped around, Catholicism and the nature of the church existed way before anybody came along and said, wait a minute, there's no papacy, there's no, magisterium, there's all of those things are the innovation. And if you're going to make that claim, you better have some rock solid way to explain how everybody was wrong for all of these years. But I think that people in their minds know that that's a bad way to think about things. So they start with their mindset of the Catholic Church just can't be true. It just can't be. So therefore, if I find something that can be twisted or with this or that, or the arguments from silence that we've talked about also, then that just somehow proves my case. But what I hear you saying is, well, then let's see that case.
Yeah. There should be the burden of proof, in other words.
Yeah.
Should be on the Protestant side.
Show me where the first guy came out and said, all right, everybody, guess what? New thing going on here. We're creating this thing called the papacy. And I know people will say, oh, well, you go back to Vatican I where they define the dogmatic, the dogmatic definition of the infallibility. But that's not what that means. They might go back further to different things and say, well, before this, nobody ever made these claims. And this is when the East and the West split. I think I want to give people the benefit of the doubt and say they're not just completely blind to the idea, but you should be able to go back and find the first guy who claimed to be Pope. If you're saying it wasn't Peter, it had to be somebody. Right.
Well, let me actually expand on that a little bit. You should be able to find him and show us what the reaction was.
Great point.
When, it's easy to say, well, the first time we see the word Trinity is in 181 AD. So I could conclude from that therefore no one believed in the Trinity before that. That'd be a bad conclusion. They did. We just don't have record of that word being used to describe that reality. So a lot of the arguments you see, when they do try to answer the question you're asking, is to say, well, this is the first time we see a pope using this title, or this is the first time we see a pope doing this. It's fine, okay. Maybe that is the first time, or maybe that's just the first time we have record of. But does the reality that that's pointing to exist before that or not? And if it's something new, if it's something that's a deviation from what's coming before, we should expect to see outcry. This isn't a hard... This is just remembering that people in history are people, that they're humans, that they're not just people and humans, but they are Christians who are striving for orthodoxy. Even if you think they're all heretics, can we at least acknowledge that they're willing to be martyred because they think they're right, and that they care a lot about being right, that they care a lot about trying to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ? And then if someone comes along and just starts proclaiming a different gospel, that they wouldn't just take that in stride and say, cool, well, it's a big tent, right? Like, if you actually go back and read the church fathers and see the kind of crazy stuff that they'll get in fights about, the examples I have are actually all Jerome. I feel like I'm picking on Jerome today. But
or Jerome.
I know. Well, like, you've got Jerome fighting with Augustine about the proper translation of certain biblical passages from Greek into Latin. Because Augustine writes him and says, hey, your new Latin, people haven't heard the scriptures this way, and they're really like scandalized and confused by this. What's going on? And so it's just, and Jerome's translation was an improvement, by the way. Augustine doesn't have enough Greek to know one way or the other. And he's not accusing, he's just basically saying, like, defend yourself because this looks like an innovation. It even wasn't an innovation. It was just a correction, a better translation. And he still had to, like, kind of answer this. Or you've got, this whole thing with, was it Rufinus? Where they're, like, talking about translating Origen's texts. Because Origen was a brilliant theologian, but had some ideas that were later determined to be heretical. And so it's like, well, should we even be translating him? Should we be quoting him at all? He's obviously brilliant in some areas, but there's other areas that are really problematic. What you see, in other words, is a church that's obsessed with orthodoxy, that doesn't have a notably big tent, that doesn't just say, hey, all are welcome regardless of what you believe. Like, no. It's like, no, we actually care about you believing the right thing, practicing the right way, and holding to the rule of faith. Given all of that, the idea that you could just sneak a papacy in there, or for that matter, sneaking like a monoepiscopacy, sneaking in the idea that, like, hey, panel, you know how you were all co-ruling bishops? Now it's just going to be me. And they're all just like, cool. Well, let's go back to our day jobs. That's like such a weird vision of history, because like, no, we would expect to see outcry. We'd expect to see commentary. We'd expect to see defenses of the change. We see none of those things, which points to the fact that it wasn't a change. Like, it points to the fact that, like, this is not some disruption to the ordinary flow of things.
So would you say, like, the first time that really happened was, around 1000 AD when the East and West broke apart? Is that really the first time that you see when people begin to make that claim and kind of say, look, we don't want to be governed by this guy in Rome?
Well, so it's a little different with the Eastern claims, because the East, even during this, is claiming, like, yes, there's some sort of headship, there's some sort of primacy that the Bishop of Rome has. What they're arguing against is a lot more like his interference in day-to-day stuff. And they're saying, well, even if he would normally be in control, he's a heretic because of these reasons, and therefore we can reject him. In that sense, like, the Orthodox argument looks a lot more like the Sede Vacantist argument that says, like, the Pope would be the Pope, but he did this thing that I don't believe in and don't agree with, and so I reject him. Than it does like the Protestant argument. They're not saying, where's the papacy coming from? Where's this idea of, like, the Bishop of Rome being in the first place coming from? That's pretty clear even from looking at the ecumenical councils. Like, when other bishops want authority, they model their authority off of the authority the Bishop of Rome has. But the ecumenical councils don't give the Bishop of Rome that authority. That authority is just treated as pre-existing. So if you read, like, First Nicaea or First Constantinople, when they're talking about other bishops' jurisdictions, in both cases, they use Rome as an example of what it ought to look like to govern. They, in neither case, try to define or determine the territory of Rome or the governance of Rome. They treat it as a pre-existing kind of reality that the church didn't, like, create at council. That's a big kind of thing. And any Orthodox who believes in the council, for that matter, any Protestant who, like, wants to take the council seriously, you just can't get around that evidence. Like, so you have to say there's some kind of special role that the Pope has, or some kind of special role the Bishop of Rome has, and then go from there. Now, in practice, by 1054, like the date usually given for the split, there's a lot of stuff that happens. You've got a Greek and a Latin culture that have really emerged, separate cultures, separate languages, people aren't talking to each other. And so day to day, year to year, like, how much authority is the Pope really exercising in the East? Very little, because it's virtually impossible to. I mean, it's not like you can't just, like, Skype the Patriarch of Constantinople and say, hey, what's going on? And so you have a lot of acrimony that just happens with this process of, like, trying to communicate via letters over the course of months and years, and things getting lost in translation and all of this. So there's a lot of bad blood that kind of builds up. But it isn't like they're saying, oh, this is a theological resentment and this is something radically new. Rather, it's like the opposite. It's like you have this slow degrading of a relationship, like a romance going sour, more than like a new innovative claim. It's like this thing that had been a really healthy relationship once upon a time, and where you have earlier Greek fathers saying really beautiful things about the Pope. Now we find it a much different environment in which there's an increasing hostility to the Pope. That's the story I think is more accurate to history. And then so you see earlier things like what was called the Photian Schism, and like it doesn't happen overnight. There's a slow buildup of things and theological disagreements, cultural and even ethnic disagreements. You've got like the Massacre of the Latins. You've got all sorts of stuff like that where it just gets to be kind of an ugly acrimony rather than like a theological innovation.
Yeah, I need to do a deep dive on that because, you do hear a lot of people say things, and it's so interesting. They'll say things like, well, if you really want to be apostolic, then you should go Orthodox, not Catholic. And then you say, well, why?
Yeah.
And they just go, because it's not Catholic. And it's almost like Orthodoxy becomes, for some people, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to people who've been wound up in Orthodoxy, but for some people, I think they can't get themselves to the idea of being a Roman Catholic, but they want the authority, they want the sacraments, or not the authority, but they want the idea of apostolic succession and sacraments and ancient church, but they feel like Orthodoxy allows them still maybe a little bit more freedom in terms of what they want to believe or how they want to be or whatever. And I need to dig into that in a more deeper way because what you're saying makes sense to me. I think when we always bring our own perspective, Joe, to these types of situations, and we think about how easy it is for information to be exchanged right now between people. I mean, we know what the Pope eats for breakfast if we want to. I mean, because we have television and Twitter and radio and all this stuff. 1,000 years ago, they didn't have that. So you could live your whole life and not even really know who the Pope was as a Christian, as a Catholic, because that wasn't really day-to-day part of your reality. Whereas now it's like the center of a lot of people's reality. So it's natural that all of this geographical distance, there is going to be this pull towards separation and saying, okay, well, we're going to kind of just do our own thing here. And we come from the apostles too. So let's just do our thing and let them do their thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you definitely have more of a centralization of authority in some ways, just from the nature of like things become better organized. And you can actually trace that story fairly easily. Like Pope Innocent III, for instance, does a good job of like organizing the governance of the papacy. He does a good job of like responding to people's letters, and before him, this is like 1200, 1198 to 1216, I think. Before him, you've got a whole series of like monk popes who are like holy guys who are spiritual leaders of the church, but they're not like famously great administrators. Then you have Innocent, who's like a canon lawyer, and he's trained in like a whole different world, and so he gets like how to run administration, and so he ends up like really organizing, making more efficient the governance of the papacy. Those kind of you can trace that whole history, right? Like this guy's really good at like responding to letters. This guy's really good at writing to things. This guy's really good at finger on the theological pulse of what's going on in the church, and you can kind of see that story go forward and backwards sometimes, right? Like some guys are just not good administrators. Some guys are not good at like running things. And so things are kind of a little more like the Wild West. That's a story you can trace, but that's a lot more like the story of, well, this dad is really good at household finances. And this dad's like not good at that, but he's good at talking to his kids. Or this dad, you know what I mean? Like, it's just comparing styles of fatherhood to say like, well, unless you are administering everything throughout the entire church, unless you're like micromanaging, you're not the Pope. That would be a false conclusion to draw from that. Like, with better technology, with better translations, with better, all of those things, it becomes a lot easier in one way to have this global reach. At the same time, the church is much bigger, so it's more complicated in other ways. It's just a different world. It's a different kind of story. But you're right that like the day-to-day touch point with the papacy is a much different thing in 2020 or 2021 than it is in like 1221 or 421.
want to back way up for a second, back to what you began talking about with this whole idea of where is that in the Bible? Because for so many people, that's the first thing. Where do I find this in the Bible? And it gets difficult when you go, we have so many things that are fundamental to our beliefs that aren't found in the Bible. So therefore, they must not be true. But I want to point out that, one argument that I used to hear all the time, that when I was going through my exploration of Catholicism, I had to just like shut it down, was, well, we don't even see in the Bible that Peter goes to Rome. So therefore, he didn't go to Rome. And how can, that's the easiest thing in the world, right? The Roman Catholic Church says that Peter's the Pope because he was the Bishop of Rome. And look in the Bible. Where does he even go to Rome in the Bible? He doesn't. Therefore, boom. And I remember reading those quotes from Irenaeus years ago. And these are guys that they're saying, no, here's where. And I would also like to remind people and say things like, the Bible never says that Peter died either.
Right. It alludes to the fact that he might have.
It doesn't say that, but it doesn't record he died. So it's just this weird thing of going, how do we apply these standards that we create to all these arguments equally? I think when you do, it just sort of takes away the bite of some of these anti-papacy arguments, because if you hold all beliefs to these standards, you wind up with nothing.
Yeah, like it doesn't say Peter had brown hair, therefore he had green hair. It is an equally valid way of doing that kind of argument from silence, which is to say, not valid at all. Like, you just can't draw that kind of conclusion from it. Now, a couple things on Peter and Rome. So like 1 Peter 5, when he says, she who's at Babylon greets you.
Yeah.
This was recognized from immediately as a reference to Rome. Like, the Babylon of the first century was Rome. It wasn't literal Babylon, which was in ruins. And so, no, Peter did go to Rome. That's alluded to. St. Paul refers to the fact somebody else has been building up the church in his letter to the Romans. And then you have Irenaeus telling us who it was. So it is like all of that authority is right there. For that matter, in 107, St. Ignatius, Polycarp's fellow student of the Apostle John, right? He writes to the Romans, and if memory serves, he says, I don't command you as Peter and Paul did. Like, it was something like that, where he alludes to the fact that, like, the Romans had actual apostles walking their streets telling them how to do things. That's all big. Like, that's... all of that evidence is there. And so it is this, it's like what we talked about before. Like, what do you do when the data seems silent? Because if you're looking at, like, if you insist on just getting biblical evidence for this, you're going to be in a rough position. Here's one of the reasons why. If you decide you can't trust the Christians of the first 200 years, if you don't think that, like, people in the age of Irenaeus are still orthodox enough to be trustworthy, if you think they're literally just, like, at a massive level lying about the historical evidence and doctoring evidence and everything else, then literally why do you believe in the New Testament? Because all of those documents pass through the hands of these same guys. And if they're forgers, if they're liars, if they're making things up to promote this vision of the world, and we know that they're also the ones telling us these are the documents that belong in Scripture, if you think that they're liars and cheats, like imagine if a Christian said, oh, I know how to get the Bible. I'm going to start with the Book of Mormon and take whatever the Mormons accept and then cut out the parts that I don't accept. You would say that is a crazy way of trying to get to the right answer, of starting with an answer you think is actually heretical and then try to cut out all the heretical pieces and seeing what's left. Well, likewise, when someone takes either the Catholic Bible and cuts out the 7 books they think are wrong, or they just take the witness of the first 200 years and then cuts out the bits that they think are wrong, that's madness. That is no way to do scholarship. It's no way to do theology. It's no way to found your beliefs. G.K. Chesterton gives a good example. He said, like, if a guy says that he was in a red balloon and floated up to the moon, you don't reject the moon part and keep the red balloon. Like, you reject the whole thing. You say, like, either this guy is, like, insane, like, I don't trust this story at all. You don't say, well, I don't trust the moon part, but, like, yeah, I bet the balloon was red. Like, that would be an insane way to do it. So likewise, like, Protestants who say, I'm going to trust these guys who I think are liars when they tell me which books belong in the Bible.
Yeah.
That is a crazy way to do theology. I don't want them to become agnostics. I don't want them to become non-Christians. But that would be much more intellectually consistent with like what they're saying about the early Christians.
Yeah, that's huge. Let's talk for a quick second about who these first guys were besides Peter. So after Peter, is it Linus or is it Clement? Who's the second pope?
Yeah, so there actually the list is confusing at one point because Peter seems to have ordained Clement as a presbyter, and then he later becomes bishop. But because of that, some of the church fathers are confused about which of them comes first. So it goes Linus and then Cletus and then Clement in terms of like the order of them being bishops. But because Clement seems to have been ordained personally by Peter to the priesthood, that this has some people who put Clement second. But historically, like there's enough evidence that says, no, Clement he's the Bishop of Rome, he's the Pope in the 90s. One of the ways we know that, so Peter dies, by the way, like 66. 30 years later, you're on the fourth Pope. You're on Pope Clement. All of that kind of, it syncs up well, it makes sense. Clement writes First Clement, and we know that dates to about 96. So that's kind of where the early guys are. Now, one of the cool things about that letter, the Corinthians have an internal dispute about authority, about like basically people don't want to accept the authority of certain presbyters in their church. And so they reach out to the Church of Rome. And they're reaching out from the east to the west. They're reaching out from, like the area around Turkey to Rome. And we know that around 95, 96, Clement responds and apologizes that it's taken him a while to get back to them because owing to the persecutions the Christians were facing in Rome. Like they're in the middle of being persecuted. They don't have time to resolve like an internal squabble between Christians right now. So whenever they wrote, we don't know exactly what day or what year they wrote to Rome, but it seems to have been pretty darn early. The kicker there is that the Apostle John is still alive, right? Like the Apostle John, he ends up, dying. He's in exile on the island of Patmos. He lives to about the year 100. And we've got decent evidence historically for both the dating of First Clement and the death of John. So John is almost definitely alive. And the Corinthians are writing to the Bishop of Rome. That's big. Like that should make us really pause and say, what in the world is going on here? Where do we see anything else like that? Like, where do we see anyone who isn't an apostle being consulted in that way during the life of the apostles? And I literally don't know of another example of them reaching out and saying, hey, resolve this dispute for us in our local church. I don't know. It strikes me as a really strong indication that there is, at that point, already a clear sense of the mission and the role of the Bishop of Rome.
So we have writings from Clement, who, Clement of Rome, that's the one. If you're looking at church fathers, you see Clement of Rome, that's the guy. Mm-hmm. Do we have other writings from, and I recognize that we don't have writings from every pope, but do we have any other writings from the early popes?
We have a writing from a brother of one of the early popes. So if you've ever heard of Shepherd of Hermas.
Yeah, sure have.
Do you know the Moratorian Fragment, the oldest list of biblical books?
Was that in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
It is a fragment found. I actually couldn't tell you where it was found. That's a good question. It might be. I don't think it was, but because it's a Christian text. But it's a similar kind of thing where we found a scrap of papyrus. We don't really know much about the history of it, other than it dates to about 170. It has the oldest list of books of the Bible, and it includes a discussion in there of like certain books as to why they do or don't make the cut. And one of the things they include is Shepherd of Hermas. Now, Shepherd of Hermas was held by some Christians to be canonical, to be inspired. And in this scrap, they explain no, because like this is a pretty recent book. Like it's not trying to be a book of the Bible. It's 2nd century. They don't say 2nd century. Obviously, they don't have that dating system yet.
Right.
But instead, what he says is like it's written by It was written during who was it? Pius the First, I think it was, in 140. It was his brother who wrote it, and it dates it to the time when like his brother was Bishop of Rome. So you have this allusion to, like, we know a little bit about just like, well, he's at least from a good family. At least his brother is like really good and writes a really good book that people were like so impressed by they thought it might be inspired prophecy. That's about, but yeah, most of the popes we don't really have a ton of evidence from during this period, at least not that I know of.
Their writings anyway, because a lot of them weren't they. I mean, they weren't popes very long,
right? And the Romans were pretty good at, yeah. So the first, I want to say the first 22 popes.
That's what I heard too. Yeah,
were all martyred. Like it's a not a good gig if you don't like martyrdom.
Which is interesting because, and here's sort of one of the crux of the matter with a lot of people who don't get it is they look at the Vatican, the papacy today, and they see all of this majesty and all of the accoutrements of that, and then they look back at early Christianity and they go, how can this be that? Yes. And no, but here's what's interesting is nobody's making the claim that this is that from the standpoint of all of the surroundings, of course. But that's not really the point. It's kind of like looking back at saying, well, what's the first airplane? And you look at the Wright brothers, at the thing they created, and then you look at like, a stealth fighter, and you go, well, this is that? Well, they're both airplanes. Yeah. They're both airplanes. And you could say that this was the first of this. This is an analogy I'm just coming up with right now, that this is the first of this. But this has been, over time, there's been way more advancements. There's been way more development. But the principles that make this thing fly were started and began here. So I think that's what's difficult for some people to understand is that, look, when Christianity now, the papacy, it's not illegal to be a Christian anymore. It's not. And we have 2,000 years of, in some ways, the fulfillment of Christ's promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church is evidenced by the nature of the papacy, because you'd think, well, if Christ wasn't behind this, how could it have lasted so long, especially given all of the bad popes that we've had over the years and the wars and the conquering and all of the times that it looked like, the Pope has to go to France and there's all this different stuff that happens over history. How is it that we still have the papacy today in a prominent role, other than to say, yes, it is, because its roots are here? But how do you respond to people who say, well, give me a break. You look at the Pope and all of his fancy stuff. You're telling me that that's the same guy that Peter was?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say short version would be I'd go to Matthew 13 with the mustard seed and the mustard tree.
Yeah.
It's easy to look at the mustard tree and say, this doesn't look anything like the seed. And it's like, it wasn't meant to. The mustard seed wasn't supposed to be a seed forever. Of course it doesn't.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And it's like, the Christians were in like small communities being heavily persecuted for their lives, but that wasn't the goal for what Christianity should look like forever. This idea of like just glamorizing the pre-Constantinian church or glamorizing the church when it's like illegal and underground. The people weren't saying, hey, we really hope Christianity becomes illegal and underground because it's like edgier. No, it was like they wanted to worship God freely. They wanted their neighbors to worship God. They wanted to make disciples of all nations. Like they want a church that all nations are there. They want to make a house of prayer for all peoples. That's the promise. That's what Scripture actually points to. And so when we try to like recreate that, we're actually being really faithless to it. In the book, I used an example of like, if you lost a kid and you had like a missing kid thing on the milk carton,
Yeah.
And then like, let's say you lose your kid at 7. 20 years later, if someone brings you a 7-year-old who looks like your kid, it's like, well, that's obviously not my kid.
Wow.
Like, obviously, like, I'm no longer looking for a 7-year-old. I'm looking for a 27-year-old now. Likewise with the church. Like, if you have lost the thread of like, where is the church? You shouldn't be looking for a church that looks 40 years old. You shouldn't be looking for a church that's 200 years old. You should be looking for a church that's 2,020 years old. Like, that's the church you should be looking for. And we can point to it. Like, it's not a great mystery where that church is. That's
a great point, Joe. And I think it's so clear and it cuts right to the heart of the matter. I want to give you the last word if there's anything else that you wanted to bring up on this topic. But I think what you said has been incredible.
Oh, thanks. No, I really appreciate it a lot. I guess the last thing I'd say is like, you're looking for the thing that has the DNA of the church. Like, you're not looking for an imitator. You're not looking for like a group of people who get together and by their own authority try to copy the image of what they think Christ is creating with the church. You're looking for the church Christ created and that has his DNA, so to speak, because that's going to just keep replicating and going forward through history. It's one thing growing and becoming bigger, in some ways more complex, in some ways maybe a little simplified because of, the communications are easier. That's like the one body, the one institution. And so if Christ really did found a visible church, where is it? Like, what does it look like?
I love it. Beautiful. Joe Heschmeyer, everybody. Get the book, Pope Peter, if you haven't got it. Follow Joe's blog at Shameless Popery, and follow his work at Holy Family School of Faith. It's an incredible group. I got to meet some of these guys in Kansas City when we were there doing the rosary, and what an incredible ministry. So I encourage you guys to check it out. Joe, thanks once again for enlightening us with your expertise on this. And I just love the way you put stuff, and I appreciate you and your friendship, and I'm so thankful that we've made this connection. And man, God bless.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Okay, everybody, thanks once again for listening to this episode of Catholic Feedback. Whether you're watching it or listening to it, please share it with someone if you found it to be helpful. And, remember, the purpose of Catholic Feedback is to connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith to everyday life. And I would stake my life on this, that connecting the papacy to your everyday life is something that's going to help you grow as a believer in Jesus Christ in a way like nothing else ever will, because it's through Jesus' promise to Peter that he holds the keys of the kingdom and the gates of hell will not prevail against his church that he builds upon the rock of Peter. Friends, that's the church that we are so thankful to be a part of. And we may not get every little bit of it and understand everything. That's okay. But we do our best to connect that to our everyday lives. And friends, I guarantee you, if you do that, you'll be blessed. So thank you so much for watching. And until I see you guys next time, God bless. Thanks for listening to Catholic Feedback with Keith Nestor. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Stewardship, a mission of faith, and is also supported by our team at patreon.com/Keith Nestor. Please consider joining our support team. Catholic Feedback is a production of Down to Earth Ministries. For more information about Down to Earth, or to bring me to your parish or event, visit down2earthministry.org. See you next time.